All right, back from New Orleans and getting back into it. Had a nice weekend off, kind of recharged my batteries. Back into some frustrations with a 73 Champ. So let me show you a little bit of what I've done this morning, and then I'll show you where we're at. Gonna finish up that 79 Champ, and there was some confusion as to the cathode, one of the cathode bypass capacitor values that I mentioned in the previous video, and I'll clear that up in a little bit in this video. But first of all, we're going to change out the speaker. So this is the original speaker, which is tiny, tiny, tiny little magnet, and the voice coil in it is going out. That's why the low-end stuff is just gone. The actual cone is fine. The dust cap isn't separated. There are no tears. The problem's all in the tiny little voice coil. And this is the new speaker. Much more substantial magnet, much heavier. The cone's a little less shallow, but it will still fit and clear all the tubes and stuff. Will sound a lot better. So I'm going to move the wiring from these terminals to these terminals. I'll do that first. All right, even though the speaker is not getting reused, best practice is to protect the cone from any drops or splashes of solder. So I have to add a little bit of fresh solder to this old stuff to get it to flow. And this was just kind of J-hooked in there. Kind of back it out as well as I can without bird nesting. I guess for those for whom English is not their first language, I should avoid terms like bird nesting, or at least explain them. If you have stranded wire, I'm going to get a section of stranded wire here on the bench. I've got some excess here. Let me strip some out for you. I guessed wrong as to, there you go. All right, so here we have stranded wire. Let me get to focus on that. And if I twist it and tin it and make it into a solid wire, that's great. But what happens is, if you don't do that, or if you have strands going everywhere, you have all these individual small wires, and they can spread out like that, or they can bunch up in weird ways. And that's often called bird nesting, because it can just be a mess. But what happens with that is, instead of having one solid wire with all the strength of each individual wire contributing, you just might have a connection held on by one or two of these little strands, and it's just not reliable. So bird nesting is what I call that, when you get things splayed out. And that can happen with speaker wire connections. This one has not done that, but I see it a lot. And I just want to make sure that any speaker connection is pretty solid, even with tiny little speakers. So there's the original desoldered. Move it to the side. And here we go with the new one. Positive on the right. And let's see here. Let's twist it a little bit better than it was. Let's fit that through and give it a crimp. Sometimes you need to expose fresh wire to get a good crimp. We don't have a lot of excess on this original wiring, and don't want to redo the whole thing. I want this to have as much mechanical support as I can reasonably achieve using the old wiring, which is just a little bit better than the J-hook from the factory. But given the small mass involved and very little strain, that J-hook held up for 40-something years. So if I were doing this from fresh, or if this were a higher wattage amp where there was real current or any real strain, I would make sure I had enough excess wire to do a full wrap, 270 degrees worth before soldering, but this will be fine. Just getting a little bit better than the factory J. And that mechanical crimp, which is hard to achieve on this stuff, just means that the solder doesn't bear the entire stress of any tugging. When doing this, it's very important not to poke through the cone with the pliers or to affect the bare wire going from this terminal strip to the cone. Just trying to get that a little bit more bent. And sometimes I'll help it out by making it a little bit more flexible just with heating it up. Get it started. Oh, there. Wanted a bird's nest. The same thing I warned against. See, that's what I'm talking about. All right, I need to redo this because I can't use this reliably. But I've got just enough slack to do it right. Dang it. It's not always possible to get it right the first time. The important thing is that before it leaves, it is right. So on this one, I twist it. And I solder the very end so the wires don't want to separate when I bend them. All right, now that, well now, get some of the excess solder off so it fits through the hole. So it fits through the hole. It's a very small opening. There it goes. Now I can get a good bend on that wire before it's tinned all the way. Each individual wire in this is tinned within the wire itself, but sometimes you get wire that is not tinned or was a long time ago and things have corroded, and you gotta clean things with acetone or whatever. Alcohol sometimes is sufficient, and then tin it before it's all soldered together. Anyway, this is a good solid connection now, and I'll just kind of give that all a new twist just for additional mechanical support. Let me show that better. It doesn't have to be picture perfect. It's not going very far, and there's not much strain on it. Anyway, this speaker is ready to go back in, and I guess a lot of that wasn't even in focus. Sorry about that. All right, time to put the new speaker back in place. This one already has all 4 holes cleared of any cone material. Sometimes you got to get in there with an X-Acto and free up a little bit of space. And this is just a matter of getting all 4 started and finger tight. I'll speed up the playback on this bit. An important thing with old Fenders like this is if you have any resistance to the threading and it wants to cross thread, it can grab and it will actually push the screw out to the other side. You can actually poke holes in the grill cloth. So when starting these by hand, they should turn freely. I don't want any resistance. When these things jam up and the screw starts to move out the other side, sometimes it's a lot of extra work to undo that damage. And so you don't want to cross thread these at all. All right, so these are just freely turning. These are all going to be just fine. At that point, I'll finish them with this tool, but I'm just using 2 fingers to turn it. I'm working in a pattern like tuning a drum. Just a little bit to each. So each one now is finger tight using this socket and just 2 fingers. Make sure they're all evenly giving the same amount of resistance for just 2 fingers. And then there are torque wrenches with the proper settings for this. Once I get it there, then I use my full hand and give it about a quarter turn each. And that seems to work just fine. You want it tight, and so any compression of the material between the frame and the baffle is compressed, but you don't want to tighten it so much that the frame itself dents or bends. So that should be just fine. If I were installing speakers all day long, I would use a preset torque setting and know exactly where it needs to be, but that seems to work just fine. All right, let's put this to the side and get back to the chassis. Now, in the previous video on this amp, I mentioned that I guess the Champ had all 22 or 25 microfarad cathode bypass caps, and the Vibro Champ had the 2 microfarad, and I was incorrect because I just hadn't had a Champ in a long time. And it's such a simple little circuit that I didn't feel the need to consult the schematic, as all the parts seem to be original, including this red cap here. But I misspoke, or I was misled by this particular amp from 1979, where instead of having 25 to 25 like earlier Champs, had 25, 10, 25. So I had replicated the values that were actually in this amp rather than the ones that were in the 60s. Now, what difference does that make? Let's talk about cathode bypass caps in this part of the Fender circuit. It's the second gain stage. In other Fenders, the same circuit point both feeds the reverb driver. This is split to the reverb circuit with the driver on one side and the mix path on the other. And that has a shared cathode. Both channels on a 2-channel Fender with reverb share that same cathode. So if this were a super reverb, for instance, that would be an 820 ohm resistor in parallel with a 25 microfarad cap. Because the stages are in parallel, that's equivalent of a 1.64K resistor in parallel with a 12.5 cap. 12.5 microfarad. In a Princeton reverb, which is a single channel, it is a 1.5K in parallel with a 25 microfarad cap. In the 60s version of the same Champ, it is a 1.5K in parallel with a 2. And the differences that you would hear in terms of bass response is that the super reverb would have a high pass frequency, below which everything is rolled off quite a bit, at 15.68 hertz, which is, well below the threshold of human hearing. The Princeton reverb would have the same thing at, I need to adjust the value, sorry. The Princeton reverb would have that same stage with a high pass at 8.2 hertz. And a Champ with a 2 microfarad bypass cap here would have the same high pass at 102.51 hertz. And that's within the audible range of hearing. And what they're doing is they're dumping some lows because they're going through a crappy 8-inch speaker. There's some other lows that are dumped in other places in the amp. We're not going to get into that. But I decided not to use the 2 hertz, which would have had to put this at 102.5 hertz. Neither did I put in the 10 that this originally had, which had it at 20.5 hertz. I decided for this amp to go with a 4.7 microfarad, which will move the high pass up here to 43.62 hertz. Now, I'm saying the decimal values because, it's accurate. We don't hear minute differences. This one's saying 43.62, and that's if this is exactly 1.5K, and this is exactly 4.7 microfarad, and the plate is exactly 100K, and the tube mu is exactly 100, and all that fun stuff. But, we hear roughly. So if this is anywhere from, 36 to 50 hertz, it's going to sound the same to us. But the difference between this being, 43 hertz versus 100 hertz versus, 8 hertz, we hear that. This is going to be a full low end, but not flubby. The 2 would be very, very tight low end. And the value from the Princeton of 8.2 hertz, that low end can get a little bit flubby, even with a 12-inch speaker. So I think this is the best way to do that for this amp. And someone else said that all these original caps and the ceramics need to be changed out. Nonsense. Every one of these is just fine, sounds great. There's no problem with any of these caps. Now, in theory, this cap and this cap should be rotated so that the outer foil is at the B plus side. In an amp with this little gain, it really doesn't matter. I'm not going to change that. What I am going to look at, though, is the bass pot, because we want to give this thing variable mid-range to make it alternate between a really nice guitar amp and a really optimal amp for use with harmonica for those not from the South. So I'd like to be able to make a switched mids thing here. And one option is I could drill into the chassis and do that. I'm going to see if there is room for me to fit a very high quality push-pull pot on this bass knob. Because while I don't want to drill into a 1979 Fender, I would not drill into a 1966 Fender. But if I can do it without making a permanent change to the chassis, great. So I'm going to disconnect this chassis ground right here, which is the mids resistor, which in this amp in stock form is a 15K, which is a bit much for good guitar sound and could be increased for a nicer harp response in terms of gain and character. We're going to remove this pot temporarily and just move it to the side. Wasn't very tight to begin with, which means I need to tighten up the other two pots before I call this amp done. So I'll move this to the side real quick, and we're going to see if something fits. I've got here, where did I put it? A really nice CTS switched pot. That's for use in a different amp. But I'm not sure if it will fit on this Fender, which has this angled front. We're about to find out. If it does fit, then I'll order one for this amp. Or I'll use this one for this amp and order another one for the other amp, because the other amp needs a bit more work before it gets ready to receive its pot. But with the angled chassis on these Fenders, this larger pot may not fit. And we're going to ignore these. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this prongs. I won't need it for any of the amps I'm using it with. Don't want it to impede sitting against the chassis. Now, one of the concerns is this bushing is a little bit long on these. So to make it fit, I have to use a couple of different tooth washers. And I'm just concerned that it's going to contact the chassis right here and not fit. And there are some other push-pull pots which would fit as far as the chassis goes. But the hole in the front panel is 3/8, and those are all going to be 7mm bushings that won't fit. Now this is not going to fit in this amp. It's just too long. So now I know. So I think the best bet to give the sonic options that we want in this amp while having a reliable connection will be to use a a very well drilled hole, much as I dislike drilling into chassis on older amps. Though again, a 79 is not all that crazy vintage. And from the owner's perspective, the better it sounds, and the more use you can get out of it without any big changes, the better. And so while I will be glad to drill a very small hole in the bottom of the chassis, I will not be doing any major things like you might find an amp that was modded in the 80s, where the whole thing gets disfigured. So tighten this up. Put the knob back. We're going to leave that 15K disconnected from chassis because we're going to be using that for our variable mids and gain boost. So the issue is whether the switch goes here in this area, closer to where it physically is in the circuit, or whether it needs to be over here where it's more available. For the owner's point of view, it's easier if it's over in this area. We've got this nice large expanse. Wouldn't require drilling into the rear panel of the amp, but you can reach around very easily and access it. Just flip the switch. Cleaner, dirtier. So I'm going to ponder that for a moment. Once I've made my decision, we'll proceed. After looking through my options, I decided to mount it right here. It's if it was up here where it would be closer to being where it is in the circuit, you'd have to reach your hand back in the back, and there's a tight squeeze with the speaker, and you could burn yourself against the power tube. Mounted here, it's towards the front, easy to reach around and feel behind the rear panel. You're not going to burn yourself on that power tube. And I've wired it so that when it's in one position, you have lowered mids compared to stock, and you have negative feedback. In the other position, the negative feedback is disconnected. And for right now, this 100K pot is in line between mids and ground. And the owner will be able to come over here and turn this until he finds a position he really likes. We'll measure that and replace that with a fixed resistor. So let's hear this as it is now. So it's back together. The chassis is not all the way in tight because I need to have access to the wires to this temporary 250K pot here. 100K pot rather, for adjusting the mids. So when the owner comes over, we can dial this in. A couple of things. I'm going to set the treble and bass at noon for this. And I've got the boost off. So the negative feedback is connected and the mids are fixed at 6.8K. First of all, there's some DC on the input. That's something that the champs are prone to that other amps of this era are not, because unlike all the other amps on the champ, they have the 68K input resistors. The grid stoppers, mix resistors, voltage dividers, however you want to call them, are mounted on the board rather than at the input jack, and they're prone to leaking DC, which is what we have here. So those are going to get moved from the board to the input jack, a new wire put in from that point to the grids on the tube socket. That problem will go away and will not recur. Doesn't happen a lot on champs, but it's there on this. Second of all, I just put in this brand new WGS G8A speaker, and I don't care for it. It doesn't have any low end to speak of. Even for an 8. And I know that the amp is putting out lots of low end. In just a minute, you'll hear it through the 2x12 again. So I don't have huge expectations of an 8-inch speaker, but this isn't even giving me what I think I have heard. I know I've heard from other 8-inch speakers. So this is not going to make it for me. I know I use a lot of WGS and I recommend them, but I'm not a shill. This one doesn't work for me, and I'll return it, and they'll send me something else because they're good guys. They're going to stand behind their product. And it's, you know, at some point you're selling ice cream. They sent me a fudge ripple. I wanted pralines and cream. It's whatever, you know, it's subjective. But for me, for this champ, for what I want it to do, this speaker isn't really cutting it. And since the speaker is not really cutting it, I can't really show you what the switch does in all its finery. So that will follow. So once I get the speaker changed and I get the DC off the input, then the owner can come over and we'll play guitar and harp through it and dial in the value of this pot where he wants it to be and get this sounding just right. But I'll give you a little preview of something closer to what it'll sound like by hooking up to the 12. All right, with quick and dirty mic placement, this ought to work pretty well. So here's the same settings on the amp. Nothing's changed on the amp through a real speaker. Flip that switch. Some of that nasty noise you hear just because this chassis is not secure to the cabinet, and so it's vibrating and buzzing a little bit. And this is exaggerated when I do this, but you know, that'll go away when this is all put together. And here's without the switch. Remember, this is noon. This is what the low end actually coming out of the amp is. So I'm going to get a speaker that has a little bit more of that low-end response and less of that upper mid-range response, because that's really predominant with this G8A, sad to say. I'm going to get rid of the last of that leaking DC on the input, get a different speaker, and we'll consult with the owner at that point about where this ends up, and I think it'll come out great.